Vice Chair Willows. Here. Mr. Adams. Mrs. Armenter. Mr. Babin. Ms. Bankston. Ms. Bourne. Mr. Gautreaux. Representative Boria. Mr. Chesson.
Here.
Mr. Cochran.
He's in. He's coming in.
Mr. Cox.
Yes.
Mr. Cresson.
He's here.
Ms. Dandridge. Here. Mr. Davis.
Here.
Ms. Jubinan. Here. Ms. Dewey.
Here.
Mr. Duffy.
Here.
Mr. Dupree. Ms. Ferry. Here. Senator Tessie. Representative Gautreaux.
Here.
Mr. Gray. Senator Hinskins. Mr. Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Landry. Mr. Macaluso.
Here.
Mr. Mallory. Mr. Matthews. Senator McMath. Dr. Malonzo.
Here.
Mrs. Benton. Mr. O'Neill.
Here.
Representative Pierre. Ms. Trail. Here. And Ms. Trish. Here.
Great, thank you. With that, we'll move on to the next item, approval of the agenda. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda? Mr. Davis, second by Mr. Chesson. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. I'd like to thank Governor Edwards for appointing a very diverse in terms of perspectives on our coastal work. And I spoke to our former chair, Keith Milling, yesterday, and I said, do you have any words of advice for this great group? Many who have been engaged in coastal work for many years. And he said, keep your eye on the big picture. And I think that is so important for us when I look at the incredible progress that's been made over the years since our coastal program was established in 1988 through Act 6 and then CPRA after Katrina. It is very impressive, and it speaks to the level of our problem and how far we've gone. And I'm so positive on the role, or positive about the role of the commissioners. As you probably know, this commission was passed into law in 2002 after being recommended by the Committee on the Future of Coastal Louisiana. And the point of the formation of the commission was a formal advisory group for the governor to assist with the coastal program. And over the years, I think we've done a lot, and we can do more in this very critical term. And one thing that I'm very hopeful about is that we have this perspective from each of you, but at the same time, we need to integrate our perspectives in order to help the coastal program. So we do need to keep our eyes on the big picture. And I just wanted to mention that I wanted to thank Governor Edwards again for appointing this group, for naming me as chair, and also Chairman Klein for being supportive, as well as our Chief Resilience Officer, Charles Sutcliffe, and Inger Pinchen and Olivia Day, who have helped us so much getting to this point. So with that, Karen Gautreaux.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to just take the opportunity to congratulate all the new members of this commission, as well as thanking all of the members who have served on this commission for quite some time. As Karen said, this commission has been around for a while now. Signed into law in 2002. This was really the first group that was formed to really discuss the protection and restoration of Louisiana's coast. And I believe it was actually done under the leadership of Karen Gautreaux, when she served in my position as Executive Assistant to the Governor for coastal activities. But ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the more diverse groups that we have in the coastal program. If you look around this room, there are a variety serve on this commission. And one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do is to not only just have this tent card in front of you that says which group you represent, but to truly, truly take the issues that you hear here, that you learn about here, back to your interest group, back to your stakeholder groups, and really discuss these issues with the entities that you represent. And so there's been a lot of discussion, ladies and gentlemen, over the last, quite frankly, year, maybe year and a half, on what do we do with this commission. When the commission was formed in 2002, the coastal program was in its infancy stages. We're now at a point in time where we've got $1.3 billion being spent on coastal restoration and hurricane protection projects. The coastal program is much more mature today than it was in 2002. And so there was discussions on whether or not we dissolve this commission, be reconstituted for another mission. But after long discussions, there's value in having all of you represent the multiple stakeholder groups that exist across South Louisiana. And while you're going to represent specific stakeholder groups and interest groups, I could not agree more with what Keith Milling said. We've got to keep our eye on the big picture. And that's our job at the state level, and that's going to be the job of this commission. And so collectively, all of our voices together will keep our eye on that ball. And I would be remiss if I did not say some things about Keith Milling on the record. As all of you who know and have worked with Keith, there is no better ambassador, there's no better advocate, there is no better proponent of coastal Louisiana than Keith Milling. And he did not have to insert himself into this conversation. But thank God he did. Because he brought a perspective and a viewpoint that I think really elevated this issue to where it is today. And so I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank King for his many years of service. And so I am excited about the new membership on this commission. I think that it's going to bring a lot of energy, a lot of life to this commission. But this is going to be the place, guys, where things are discussed, where they're vetted, where they're talked through before they are elevated to the full CPRA board for formal approval. And so I use this word a lot when we're talking about master plan or annual plan or sediment diversions. It is called productive participation. Participate productively in the conversation. You're on this commission for a reason. We want engagement, we want feedback, we want questions, we want you to challenge us. And that's what makes us better. So please don't be apprehensive or feel like that there's going to be repercussions for things that you say here. This is an advisory commission, advising the coastal program and advising the governor. And so with that, Madam Chair, I want to congratulate you on your appointment. Governor Everett has all the confidence and faith in you, and I know you'll do an incredible job.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. I think it would be worth doing very quickly, just going around and introducing each other since this is our first gathering. So,
Hello, good morning. My name is Simone Laws. I am the campaign director for Restore the Mississippi River Delta, which is a collection of NGOs working on this issue.
William O'Neill. I am here on behalf of the Louisiana Landowners Association.
Good morning, Earl Longstaff. I'm with the Louisiana Sea Grant College Program, where I also got out of the campus, and I'm here representing the academic community.
Good morning, I'm Jeanette Devinen. I'm the Director of Resilience and Adaptation at the Center for Planning Excellence.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Trish. I'm Executive Director with Louisiana Wildlife Federation.
Chris Macaluso, I'm the Marine Fisheries Director for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership.
I'm Cynthia Dewey. I'm a policy consultant. I work for several NGOs, local particularly, and a couple of national.
pursuing Institute of Water Resources Law and Policy, and apparently I represent people named Mark.
Sean Duffy, Big River Coalition, Louisiana Maritime Association, navigation representative.
Steve Cochran, I work for the Environmental Defense Fund, representing nonprofit corporations and censors.
Good morning, Arthur Johnson, CEO of the Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development, community-based nonprofit, based in the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. Glad to be here and representing the community.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Daniels. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Collaborative in New Orleans, Feeder 513, working on climate adaptation and mitigation in urban areas.
James Cox, I represent the ag interest, put on here through Farm Bureau of Louisiana.
Rhaegar Fallow, State Representative of District 103, which is all of St. Bernard, the East Bank of Plaquemines Parish, and the easternmost portion of New Orleans. Kind of the toe that is the boot of Louisiana, and the area that is arguably disappearing into the Gulf most quickly. So these types of issues are critical to my district and to me personally, because I'm with it. So thank you. And Chip, you said everything very well. I really think that we have to vet these issues very closely, which you have been very good at. I'm glad to see we're meeting again post-COVID, and I know that we're going to move forward and truly implement these issues with all of the projects that we're proposing on a good level. So thank you very much.
Hi, Stephanie Ferry. I'm an investment banker with Raymond James. I'm representing the business and industry community. I work with local governments in the state on capital projects, including levee improvements and drainage.
Dwayne Bourgeois, Executive Director for the North Goose Levee District. I'm also a member of the board for CPRAs. I'm a holdover from the last time this group was together for the Association of Levee Boards. And I have to just say that, you know, what we're looking to do here by broadening out the representation of the Association of Levee Boards into different areas, I think is important for everybody, just like Chip said, represent your agency.
I'm Chet Chasson, the Executive Director for the River Port Commission in charge of Port Fourchon, and I'm representing ports and related industries.
Thank you so much. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles Sutcliffe to give us some background about the powers and duties of the commission and discussion as well. Actually, I skipped ahead and then discussion. Sorry, Charles. Talk a little bit about our commission. Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. So thank you, Karen, and everyone for being here today. I do had a few slides kind of on background, but I think Chip and Karen covered most of it. But I'll also just do quickly just a little bit of things. But first, I do want Olivia, could you stand up so everybody can kind of see you? Olivia Day in our office is going to be kind of helping support the commission, commissioners, as we kind of get things up and moving again. Just want to make sure you put a name to the face. And again, I've been sending a lot of emails now, but sometimes it might be coming from Olivia. And yeah, so let's look at this, a little bit of the background and history. As was mentioned, you know, so many of the stories about how CPRA got started start with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, but it really does go back to the late 80s and 90s. And in those days, you can kind of see the understanding of the problem was developing, and the kind of the capacity of the state to do something about it was also developing. So, you know, it really wasn't until, as was mentioned this morning, a committee on the future of coastal Louisiana came together in 2001, and kind of following kind of Coast 2050, the PRO Act, State Level Authority, kind of once they kind of said this is really a $14 billion kind of a problem, that was the first time kind of the scale of it kind of started to emerge. And then so the Committee on the Future of Coastal Louisiana really started to ask some really practical questions about how does the state come together to kind of address a problem of this scale and this importance that has so many different implications and so many different effect on so many different types of users. So that's kind of where it came from. And so one of the recommendations from that committee report was that we need an advisory committee to kind of hear from the different stakeholders as we kind of put this all together. And so, as Chip mentioned earlier, said, in the very, very early days, it was a crucial sounding board for the formation, the structure, and evolution of the program. Looking back at some of the recommendations that came out in some of the 2007, 2008 reports, even some of the issues and some of the recommendations that were made are still very relevant. They have a different, maybe flavor to them today, but they're still important issues, I think. So coordination with the federal government was an issue, it remains an issue. Permitting speed and ease is still an issue. They're really a big voice for increasing the scientific and managerial capacity of CPRA. So if we're going to have an agency that does this, we're going to have some people kind of getting that stood up. Engaging the public has been something that's been called out from the very beginning. It's super important for this issue, as well as protecting the public trust. So those are some of the big picture issues that this group has kind of touched on or had a big role in. And then they've also taken deep dives from time to time. So this is a short list. It's just from my time here. Some issues that this group kind of spent 1 or 2 meetings on, or a subcommittee on, or kind of special attention to. So one was when the Corps and the state kind of transferring over to the modified Charleston method of mitigation. There was a big issue on how that was working, and we spent a lot of time on that issue. Right in the aftermath of the BP oil spill, the Coast Guard was, in the state's opinion, not doing a great job of communicating with local parishes about cleanup efforts. They were kind of always trying to be done, and we were always trying to have them continue to clean up, and that was a big issue. One more kind of in the conflict resolution space, I think, for that one for us. There's been a diversion subcommittee on and off because diversions have been talked about throughout the history of this program and longer, and they were able to take really deep dives on the science, on engineering, on the stakeholders and concerns, in smaller formats, but really kind of follow that issue along. I think that's obviously still relevant today. And then, of course, funding this program is always something that we're trying to get our heads around, and so that's another issue that in the past has been important, and I think we'll see in the future. This commission was created by statute around 2009, so it's been around longer than the statute, and it resides in the office of the governor. And really, if you can kind of see, and I'll just show on the next slide, stakeholder representation is the real primary objective here. So the CPRA board is the official policy-making board now, obviously, of the coastal program, but that representation is primarily state agencies and regional representatives. So here's where we hear from different types of interests, whether it's landowners or industry or environmental groups, levee districts, directly kind of do these key functions that Chip mentioned well. So it's to advise the governor and the executive assistant relative to the overall status and direction of the state's coastal program. So that's, again, that big picture look. Again, this is a forum, an important forum for exchanging information, fostering cooperation, reviewing scientific and engineering findings, and resolving conflicts. So having the ability to come together in public, outside of the CPRA board, communicate and go into these issues has been important for us over time. And then, again, back to funding, to really assist in the identification of potential funding sources and develop advice with respect on kind of how expenditures should be made. And then finally, the Commission does issue a report every March by law to the legislature. This year, since we're only going to have kind of one meeting behind our belt, it'll mostly be like just a letter kind of telling them about our status, the new members, that kind of thing, and then we'll be driving towards actual recommendation to do the rest of the and then so this is a really big board, and not everybody can always make it, so I just wanted to kind of show the full breadth of membership quickly here. The governor has 28 appointments directly, various seats. I think we have at least one person from every one of these seats here today. And then the legislature has 6 seats. So we've got the Speaker of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, as well as the chairman of the committees that all the coastal bills and programs go through in session, also have representation either through themselves as the chairperson or through the designee. And then again, the Association of Flood Boards of Louisiana has 2 seats that they submit. The only requirement there is that at least part of those levee districts represented have coastal territories. And so again, this was mentioned earlier, but I just again to be clear for the group, just to kind of see what our role is here. You know, it's clear there are diverse needs and diverse users of Louisiana's coast, and that's what makes it so important, but everybody is kind of threatened by the land loss crisis together. So our job here is to really come together to advance the coastal protection and restoration agenda writ large. So we have you here because you are an expert in your area, and you have a lot of experience, but we really want you to kind of not just kind of speak from that narrow experience, but also apply it to kind of the bigger picture that's been said a few times already this morning. So with the introduction, I just want to let everybody know we would like to give you a sense of what the rest of the year looks like. We're looking at another 3 meetings this year. We hope, I think, is good cadence for us. So sometime in early April, probably in Baton Rouge, because session might have started by then. I know a lot of folks here are busy with that. And then again in the summer, either June or July, and then once more in October. That still gives us time to do a field trip or something else if we need to or want to. And hopefully, either by the end of this week or the next week, we'll have some specific dates to go towards. And with that, if there are no questions, I know that you guys are really here to hear from Stu about the coastal master plan. But I'm happy to answer a question if anybody has one.
Charles, you may have mentioned this. We won't always meet you that much. You said maybe a field trip or maybe going, like sometimes you've hopped around before, and that's still something that you're interested in.
Yeah, we know that Baton Rouge is not convenient for the entire coast. So yeah, we're hoping to, at least that summer meeting for sure this year, to be out of town. We don't have a place yet, but we're looking into it. So that's an intention that we have.
Do you happen to have a copy of one of the previous reports, like a standout that you could share with us so we can just, you know, kind of flip through it? I think the reporting element is very important, and I'd like to get a feel for expectations.
That's great. I'll make a note of that and send that out after this meeting. We've got that. That's great. Okay.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks.
Now, here from Stu on the master plan, or Brent, also known as Dennis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I've got a couple of reports this morning that was identified as Ben on the radio. So, as they say, you can call me what you want, just don't call me late for dinner. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's great to be before this group again. We really take a lot of pride and get a lot out of presenting to this group, getting feedback from this group. You all have tremendous input on everything that's related to the coastal program. It's also good to be charging into a new year, 2023. Lots of good stuff happened in 2022. I'll not go back over all of that, but I can tell you that folks at CPRA are headed into 2023 with a determination to get things done, to implement our coastal program like never before. And a big part of that is related to the document that you have in front of you. This is an updated year for Louisiana's coastal master plan. And to borrow a term from the chairman, as he mentioned earlier, this document really is designed to keep our eye on that big picture ball, right? It sets the vision for our coast and hopefully gets us all pulling in the same direction in terms of what it is that we want to accomplish for our coast. So the draft was released publicly just last Friday. This is a very, very new document. Many of you probably have not had a lot of time to get through it yet, and so we're going to be presenting some of the details of the document to you here today. But I can tell you just at a high level, as past master plans have done, this master plan really results in literally hundreds of acres of our coastal wetlands being on the ground at the end of 50 years that otherwise wouldn't be there. And has the potential to reduce risk to less than it is today. So let me repeat that, because that's a very important point. It has the potential to reduce our storm risk to less than we experience today in the future. So that's a pretty remarkable statement if you think about that. With this hand in hand, really turning the crank on the tools that Stu will describe to you a bit and really kind of getting into the gears, if you will, in terms of how projects are nominated, developed, and evaluated. So with that, I'm going to stop talking about the master plan. I'm going to ask Stu to come up, but before he does, I also just want to make one mention. We, as you all know, every year present an annual plan as well. So while we're not presenting that to you all here today, we will be presenting that to our board next week. And I think folks will be pleased. Those that are interested in our coast will be interested. I think you'll see a comparable number of projects that will be active. We anticipate in the upcoming fiscal year. And you're going to see, I think, another record-breaking year in terms of expected revenues and expenditures in the future. So with that, I'm going to ask Stu to come up. He's going to get into the weeds a little bit more with you all on the 2023 master plan. We certainly appreciate your attention, and I look forward to hearing all of your feedback. Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, I'm Stuart Brown. I manage the strategic planning branch here at CPRA. As Brent mentioned, it's a really exciting time for us. We are rolling out the 2023 master plan. So this presentation is intended to be an overview of the 2023 master plan. As we do these presentations, Brent is constantly having me call down slides because I want to talk about everything in a great deal of detail. I'm going to try to hit things at a high level and hopefully hit them at a level that is understandable and not too much detail, but I will note that a huge amount of effort has gone into this plan, and there's a huge amount of resources available if you're interested in different aspects of this plan. The document itself is only a part of it. Hundreds or thousands of pages of appendices. We have recorded presentations on our website helping explain some of the finer points of the plan. So I'm going to provide an introduction, some context for CPRA and the master plan. These are things that I suspect most of you know, but every presentation could be somebody's first, and we want to make sure that we can provide kind of context for why we're doing what we're doing, both at CPRA and with the development of the master plan. I'm then going to give a brief overview of the technical process of how we identify and select projects to be included in the master plan. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what is new for 2023. So, of course, we update this plan every 6 years. This gives us an opportunity to reassess the available data, the tools that we're using, and process for how we develop this plan. And in this way, we're able to ensure a process that is adaptively managed and incorporates the best available information. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the outcomes of the 2023 master plan that we highlighted. So first, just a kind of near-term timeline. The draft plan was released on Friday. The public comment period is open through March 25th. We're, of course, presenting here to the Governor's Advisory Commission. We'll be presenting to the board a similar presentation on the 18th. We have 4 public hearings scheduled, spanning from January 31st to the 16th. Then we're going to be incorporating those public comments, putting together what will be called our draft final, which will go to the board on April 19th and hopefully be approved by the CPRA board. And then it will be submitted to the legislature following that board approval. So this is that big picture context, something that I suspect y'all are familiar with, but Louisiana has been experiencing a coastal land loss crisis for nearly a century. We've lost almost 2,000 square miles of coastal wetlands since 1932. There are many causes for this land loss. Some of these are natural processes you would expect to see in this sort of system, but a lot of it is the result of, or at least exacerbated by, human activity. The land loss, of course, is significant from a landscape and habitat perspective. It directly impacts the fisheries and wildlife and the folks who make their living off of those resources. But it also affects industries like agriculture that need to be able to drain their fields, that need access to fresh water. It affects navigation. It affects oil and gas activities in the coastal zone. And of course, land loss also increases the flooding impacts of hurricanes and tropical storms. And that's the way that most coastal citizens experience this changing coast. With more open water, with deeper open water, with less vegetated land in between the Gulf and where people reside, we see greater impacts of tropical storms and hurricanes. So what's at stake is our homes, our jobs, and our culture. The big picture goal is a resilient coast, one in which people can continue to live and work and take advantage of all the things that make Louisiana so economically, ecologically, and culturally important. So Charles covered a bit of this, and actually he one-upped me because I do start my history of CPRA with the hurricanes of 2005. But CPRA was established following that storm season. There was a realization that the folks working and administering our restoration programs were split up among different state agencies. Our risk reduction folks were in yet another state agency, and there wasn't a single entity that could clearly articulate the state's goals when it came to how the state wanted to address coastal land loss and coastal flood risk. So CPRA was established to be that entity and given a mandate to develop, implement, and enforce a comprehensive restoration and risk reduction master plan. So what is the master plan? At its core, the master plan is a prioritization effort. It's how can the state spend its money most cost effectively over the next 50 years to reduce storm surge-based flood risk and build and maintain coastal wetlands. Importantly, it is not a funding source, it is not a program. The projects identified in the master plan are not necessarily funded for construction. As funding becomes available through a range of different funding sources, these are the projects we want to pursue. And as funding becomes available, they move from this conceptual master plan level into feasibility studies, engineering design, construction. Ultimately, we operate, maintain, monitor these projects, and everything we learn from that process feeds back into how we evaluate, prioritize, and design these projects in the future. The plan is developed through a process that ensures adaptive management. As mentioned, we're required by law to update this plan every 6 years. It's built on world-class science and engineering. It advances a comprehensive and integrated approach to restoration and risk reduction. And this last bullet point is one that we're stressing with this master plan, and something that I hope is evident in the plan in front of you, is that it helps illustrate how people and communities will experience a changing coast and allow preparation and adaptation in the future. So we know that whether we're 100% successful in implementing the projects that we identify or not, the coast is going to look different 50 years from now than it does today. And helping illustrate how it may be different in terms of natural resources, in terms of exposure to flood risk, can help people make the best decisions they can about their future in coastal Louisiana. So we also know that the project of having a resilient coast is much bigger than the restoration and risk reduction project that CPRA implements, so we believe that's a big part of it. It's going to be the result of decisions made by countless individuals, communities, local governments, businesses, all levels of government, and making sure that we have information available to those groups, accessible, understandable, can help ensure that they can make the most informed decisions that they can. And so the objectives of the master plan are flood protection, reducing storm surge-based flood risk, restoring, utilizing natural processes, restoring and maintaining coastal habitats, and preserving our cultural heritage and our working coast. So that is to say that the goal is not to create a refuge of the coast. The goal is to continue to have communities in the coast that can continue to, again, take advantage of all that coastal Louisiana has to offer. So I do want to take a moment to point out that this plan is not developed by CPRA scientists and engineers in a vacuum. We rely quite a bit on advisory groups and public input. This is a snapshot of some of the public engagement we've had over the last few years. This is as of the time the plan was printed about a month ago, so these are ever changing. And certainly there are a lot more opportunities over the next few months for public engagement. Also, want to point out again that we have quite a lot of engagement from either advisory groups that we have with representatives of different state and federal agencies, with representatives of industry and landowners and businesses, representatives from academia. A lot of the members of this commission have been on or are on some of these advisory groups that really help guide the direction of the master plan. Also, quickly want to acknowledge that we have an incredibly talented team here at CPRA, but this is an enormous effort, and we are relying on technical support from really some exceptional folks from academia, other state and federal agencies, as well as contractors. This represents truly some of the people at the absolute forefront of their fields, and has enabled us to put together what is extremely well-regarded technical document. All right, so first I want to give a kind of general overview of the master plan process, the process by which we identify and select projects to be included in the master plan. This is figure 1.1 in the plan. I think it's page 5. It is probably better suited to exploring on your own rather than me trying to point at all the arrows and small text. But the key here for this kind of high-level summary is the categories of projects, modeling, and prioritization. So we begin with the suite of candidate projects. These projects come from a wide range of sources. We have public solicitations. We mine past master plans. We also have regional work groups this time that we set up to help, one, develop new project ideas, but also refine some of the project concepts that have been kicked around in some cases for decades. So we start with a suite of candidate projects. We then identify attributes and costs for these projects. So this is like a really high-level design. We need to know what it takes to actually build something like this in terms of cost, in terms of sediment needs, in terms of the time that it would take to build something like this. So we start with those suite of candidate projects, and then we model these projects. And we want to understand how these projects perform over 50 years across a range of potential future environmental scenarios. So we're not interested, we're not measuring the difference in the landscape from now to 50 years from now. We're measuring the difference of how this project performs over the next 50 years compared to the future in which we don't implement that project. We have 3 sets of models. The first we call our integrated compartment model. This is our landscape model. So when you see these blue and green maps of land change, this is the model that produces those. But we're also tracking or modeling hydrology, vegetation, wetland morphology, and from those variables we can make assumptions about the sort of habitats that will be supported in the future. Those landscapes feed into our storm surge and wave modeling. So as I mentioned earlier, with historic land loss, also true with future land change, with continued land loss, with continued or deeper and more open water, the impact of tropical storms and hurricanes will be greater. And so we want to understand how that impacts our storm surge and risk in the future. So the landscapes feed into the storm surge modeling. We look at a huge number of different possible tracks and speeds and intensities for hurricanes. And then the last model is our risk model. So the first thing that does is it helps us understand the likelihood of different flood depths across the coast. So we're not actually planning for any individual storm. We're planning for the possibility of a wide range of potential future storms. And so understanding the likelihood of different flood depths at all given points across the coast. And then the second thing it does is tells us what damage would be caused by those flood depths. So if we know something about the assets that are there, the communities, the buildings, the roads, we can tell what sort of damage would be done. So if we know the likelihood of different flood depths and the damage associated with those different flood depths, then we can estimate we can make an annualized estimate of damage into the future. Then the last step is our prioritization. Our uncreatively named planning tool is really a optimization equation or algorithm. And so the models tell us how a project performs over time. The planning tool helps us identify the suite of projects that performs best in terms of reducing storm surge-based flood risk and building and maintaining coastal wetlands. And we're constrained by funding. This is a 50-year, $50 billion plan with $25 billion allocated for risk reduction and $25 billion allocated for restoration. And we're also constrained by sediment availability. So a lot of these restoration projects require a huge amount of sediment that's not always readily available near to where we're building these projects. And so the planning tool helps us track that dynamically. If sediment's used by one project, it's no longer available for another project, and we have to adjust costs for those projects accordingly. We also have metrics that use model outputs as well as community characteristics, whether that's demographic information or information about major industries in those communities, to help understand how coastal change and the projects that we're evaluating will impact different industries or different types of communities. And this can be used as a check during the process that allows us to make sure that we're not selecting suites of projects that are disproportionately affecting certain communities or certain resources. All right, so what's new in the Coastal Master Plan? We're revisiting this diagram just to point out once more that the starting point for this master plan is past master plans. We're building upon the tools and processes that we developed in past master plans, where we're able to incorporate newly available data, new understandings of the systems that we're working in, and improve the process to give us better outcomes. So I'm going to hit these at a fairly high level, but we have improvements in the data that goes into our modeling. So of course, we have a dynamic system. We need to be using the most up-to-date information we have about things like the landscape. We're losing tens of square miles a year. It's important that we're not using 10-year-old data to help inform our models. But a couple that I want to highlight is we have a new storm suite developed by the Army Corps. This replaces an old suite of synthetic storms that we use. And to simply put, this just gives us a better understanding and better ability to project future storm surge impacts than the suite we were working with in the 2017 plan. Another advancement, the storm surge tells us what flood depths we might see. We have to then figure out what the damage would be that would be caused by that. Is we have a huge improvement in our asset database. In addition to having access to asset databases that simply weren't available or available to that simply weren't available at the time, we've developed a new asset database to understand kind of where different features are, different assets are, characteristics of those features. Are they single-family residences, multifamily residences, commercial, industrial, what type of industrial? In addition to that, one of our partners, Dave Johnson with Purdue, has developed a machine learning approach to estimating first floor elevations using Google Street View imagery. And so in addition to knowing more about the structures and their value at a given site, we know about how high off the ground they are. And this, of course, makes a huge difference in our ability to estimate damage caused by flooding. It makes a big difference if it's slab on grade versus on 6-foot piers. Again, really improved our analysis and our process. This is one that we could easily spend hours talking about, but I will just use this as a way to plug the CRIMS data set. So most of y'all are familiar in Louisiana, we have the Coastwide Reference Monitoring System. This is roughly 400 sites across the coast. We have continuous hydrology data, we have biannual vegetation surveys, We have biannual elevation surveys, and among other categories of data being collected. And now these sites began coming online in 2007, 2008. Now that we have 10, 12 plus years of data to help inform our modeling, we're really able to reassess some of the assumptions about how wetlands respond to different stressors of water levels and salinities in ways that we just didn't have access to in the past. And so it's allowed us to reconsider some of the assumptions that in the past we made based on best professional judgment or literature review. We can actually now see in the CRIMS data set whether those assumptions are correct, and we can adjust accordingly. This represents a really interesting advancement. It's documented extensively. And then lastly, to hit this at a fairly high level, there have been advances in our understanding of environmental drivers, and we're talking about environmental drivers. These include climate-related drivers like temperature and sea level rise, as well as things like subsidence that are not tied to climate change. Despite these advancements, there remains a fair amount of uncertainty, and because of this uncertainty, we take what we call a scenario approach to better understand the range of potential future outcomes. So you'll see throughout the plan, we talk about a lower environmental scenario and a higher environmental scenario. These scenarios were selected for this project evaluation process. We don't want to indicate that either of these represent a precise prediction of the future or that they represent the full range of possible outcomes. But within the context of this prioritization effort, the higher scenario represents something that is less likely to occur, but would be extremely consequential if it did occur. And so we want to understand how projects will perform under that future scenario. And then we have a lower scenario that's more within the range of what the current state of the science suggests are more likely outcomes. And our goal in selecting these projects is selecting projects that will perform well, whether we realize a more severe future outcome or a more moderate future outcome. So we're moving from the technical improvements to the process improvements. Well, these are also technical. We're moving from the new information, new science improvements to process improvements. One of the big improvements with this plan, and Brent mentioned this off the top, was to develop these regional work groups, to take more of a regional approach with our development of this plan. And this is based on the feedback we got during the 2017 process, and following that process, we heard the issues of the Cheniere Plain and the solutions of the Cheniere Plain are not those of Terrebonne, are not those of Pontchartrain, and we really think you guys should consider kind of working with local experts to find more tailored solutions and better represent the needs of these different regions. So we developed this regional work group approach. It includes representatives from the parishes, landowners, academics, NGOs, agency representatives, people who've been living and working in those areas for a long time. And these groups, one, helped us develop and refine project ideas, but also served as a venue to communicate about the progress in the plan and communicate about region-specific issues. And if you look at the plan, there's about a quarter, a third of the plan that's devoted to these regional sections, and a lot of the storylines in those sections come from those discussions with those regional work groups. What is important to this community, or these regions? What is important that we communicate in the plan about what living in the coast may look like with all these changes we're projecting. Another set of process improvements I want to touch on at a very high level, and again, these are written up in more detail in the plan, is the first is we developed a new risk metric. And so this one is called expected annual structure damage, and it's meant to be a response to some of the criticisms of risk metrics that are based on dollar values The criticism being that risk metrics that look solely at dollar values may end up in a process like ours, selecting projects that provide protection to areas with more valuable assets or more affluent, more wealthier communities. And so we developed an additional metric that simply put removes the asset value from the equation. The end result is something that is the proportional structural damage. That is not a very intuitive metric, but our analysis doesn't really care if it's intuitive. But it helps us understand, really it helps us understand how many structures or how many homes would be impacted by current and future flood risk, to try to take that asset value part out of the equation. Both of these metrics are important. We use both of them in our project selection, but it's important they tell us different things about the type of risk that communities experience and the type of risk that will be mitigated by the projects we are selecting. Another advancement is that we're prioritizing projects across a range of environmental scenarios. So I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, but in the past we evaluated multiple scenarios, and then we selected projects in 2017 based on the highest scenario. When you pin your plan to a particular scenario, there are trade-offs if you are to realize a different scenario. And so for this master plan, we're trying to select projects that will perform well, whether we realize that more severe future condition or whether we realize a more moderate future condition, and will be effective under both scenarios. And then lastly, this is a bit separate from the process that we just illustrated in terms of how we select projects. We undertook a number of efforts to try to better understand or better present how the coast is going to change and how people may experience that change, and present it in ways that hopefully people find more meaningful than us talking about these kind of abstract metrics being changed by percentages. And one type of analysis we're doing is looking at historic storms. And so we took the wind fields from historic storms, we modeled those on our current landscape, and we modeled those on our landscape 50 years in the future under our lower scenario. And so we can illustrate what sort of changes in flood depths, changes in damages we might see 50 years in the future. The example at the top is Hurricane Rita over the central coast. And this may be intuitive, but with continued land loss, with sea level rise, with subsidence, we see 2 to 3 feet additional flooding, sometimes greater than 3 feet additional flooding in these areas. And we see flooding creeping in further into communities like Abbeville and Delcombe, Abbeville and Delcombe. And so this is just one way that hopefully people can maybe better understand what we mean when we're talking about this coastal change over the next 50 years. Another analysis that we took on was an analysis of high tide flooding. We picked, I think, 8 different communities. We highlighted a number of these in the plan. But high tide flooding is flooding that's not associated with a tropical storm or a hurricane. This is the sort of normal frontal passage flooding you might see communities like Delacroix and Delcroix and Dulac might see on a more regular basis, whether that's a few times a year or every few years, and looking at, one, what exposure these communities have or different key points in these communities have currently to high tide flooding, and then what that might look like 25 and 50 years into the future with continued sea level rise and subsidence. And this is under a future without further action. All right. So the master plan itself, we selected 61 restoration projects and 12 risk reduction projects. We also identified $11 billion for non-structural risk reduction. Starting with the few high points about the restoration project, we identified $12.7 billion in use and diversions. I put that asterisk there because, importantly, the mid-Barataria diversion, the mid-Breton diversion, and the river reintroduction into Maurepas Swamp are considered to be part of our, what we call our future without action. They're in the baseline condition. We are evaluating projects to understand how they perform in the context of those projects being on the ground, because we expect them to be constructed And we want to select projects that will work synergistically with those projects, not projects that may cause complications with them. So this total number in terms of investment and diversions is lower than in the past. That's largely to do with a lot of these projects have been moved into our baseline condition, are already accepted as part of the coastal system. Another difference from past plans is we have these land bridge projects. And so I think we've all heard about land bridge projects as restoration efforts in the past. This came out of the regional work groups where we kept hearing we want to build a land bridge project in this area or this area. And so we said, all right, well, what do we think that project will do? And we heard a lot about being a hydrologic constraint, limiting saltwater intrusion, limiting tidal variability in the upper basin. And so we went back, we modeled a bunch of different orientations of these types of projects, and we found out that we actually need to build a more substantial project than kind of previously we conceived of as a land bridge project. And so these are designated as separate from marsh creation because they include features to make sure that the project itself is more substantial, will actually have the ability to make those sort of changes in the basin hydrology. Another highlight, over $19 billion is in dredging projects. Dredging continues to be a huge part of the coastal master plan. It is an effective strategy. It is effective in most areas, and some of these other project concepts are not always applicable. Diversions, of course, are limited to areas with river. Hydrologic restoration also has its limitations. And then the last thing we want to point out is that there's $2.5 billion of that $25 billion allocation that is set aside for what we're calling programmatic projects. And this is something that was in the 2017 plan as well. But well, there are different types of projects here, and for different reasons, these projects don't necessarily make sense to be evaluated in our framework. So barrier islands, the need for barrier island restoration is highly dependent on acute events like storms. And so if we were to evaluate projects in our plan, we might select this barrier island and this barrier island, but not this one. Well, the storm comes, and now that barrier island needs attention. So with this realization in 2017, CPRA established the BISM program to treat barrier islands programmatically. We also take a similar approach for things like small-scale hydrologic restoration, oyster reefs, shoreline protection. These are projects that we know can be effective, often on relatively small scales, and are best implemented through programs that can evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, like the QIPRA program, like the parish matching program, like the partnership fund. And so the results of the project selected in this master plan, that under our lower scenario, around 314 square miles is of land is built or maintained that otherwise would be lost at year 50. And under our higher scenario, we see about 233 square miles of land built or maintained at year 50, though we see that maximum benefit at year 40. And what we see in that kind of drop-off here is a lot of the restoration projects, the marsh creation projects that were selected early in the process are effective for 30, 35 years, and then in that last decade, when exposed to those higher rates of subsidence, higher rates of accelerated sea level rise, are no longer able to keep pace with that relative sea level rise. And so that's what that kind of diminishing return at the end of the higher scenario. But as we mentioned before, the higher scenario represents something that is less likely, but we do, for the purpose of prioritizing these projects, want to understand the impacts. So this is our lower scenario at year 10. At year 20, with land gain in green and land loss in blue. Year 30, year 40, and year 50. This is our higher scenario, land loss with the plan year 10, year 20, year 30, year 40, And year 50, we see a lot of those projects that were put in at the early parts of the plan. If you look at Marsh Island, the southern parts of Terrebonne, the areas around Fort Fourchon and Grand Isle, those are ones that are again, really effective for 30, 35 years, but fall off in that final decade when subjected to those fairly high rates of sea level rise and subsidence. On the risk reduction side, we selected 12 structural risk reduction projects, a total of $14 billion. This is projected future flood depths, a 1% chance flood depths with those projects on the ground at year 50. And this is the difference. And of course, we see those signatures of flood risk reduction behind the Morganza system, behind some of these South Central projects, behind the Upper Barataria project. And then this is risk represented spatially with the plan. We still see risk in a lot of these highly populated areas. And this is the difference map in terms of the amount of risk that's reduced at year 50 in a future without action versus a future with action. And of course, we see those signatures behind the levee systems of flood risk being reduced. We also, interestingly, we see a risk reduction out in the Chenier Plain and the Lake Charles sulfur areas, and that is solely due to restoration projects. So there are no structural projects in this analysis out there, but the restoration projects do represent a reduction in risk compared to a future without action at year 50. This is not to imply that there is less risk 50 years from now than there is today, but there's less risk compared to a future in which we don't implement those restoration projects. So non-structural projects are a significant component of the master plan. So by non-structural, we're talking about elevating homes, flood-proofing businesses, and voluntary acquisition in areas that are exposed to particularly high levels of flooding. Importantly, and sometimes the way I present this may not convey this is not at all an afterthought. We define non-structural projects for all of the 300 and some communities across the coast, what it would cost to implement these projects, what sort of risk would be alleviated by these projects, and importantly, what sort of residual risk there would still be in these communities. We analyze them the same way that we would analyze a structural project in terms of the costs and the risk reduced by those projects. But importantly, we're not identifying, Mandeville is in the plan, Macomb is not in the plan, and so on across the coast. And there are a few reasons for this. But mostly it comes down to the fact that the scale that we're evaluating these is not consistent with the scale at which these are implemented. We're evaluating these at community levels that can have hundreds to tens of thousands of structures in them. These are typically implemented at the structure level, sometimes at the street level, rarely at the neighborhood level. And so when we're looking at a community that may be the size of Macomb or the size of Mandeville, within that community, there may be really great investments for non-structural mitigation. There may also be some not so great investments for non-structural. And if we were to say that certain areas are in or out of the plan, we may preclude some of those areas that, again, have very real needs in terms of non-structural. We may preclude them from having access to certain funding sources because their projects are not consistent with the master plan. So we don't have a list of projects that are in or out of the master plan in terms of non-structural, but we do have a lot of information on what non-structural may look like at a community level, what different sorts of interventions would do in terms of reducing risk, in terms of what sort of residual risk you would still have in those communities. And this can serve as a starting point for discussions with those communities that are interested in pursuing that sort of mitigation effort. It can also serve as a starting point for communities who are looking to solicit funding from a range of different funding sources for those sort of interventions. As I mentioned, we do define projects. These bullet points are maybe a little bit too detailed, but we do define non-structural projects, and we use that to help us make sure that we're not selecting structural projects where we could better invest our money into non-structural projects. So it's part of the selection process. And through that process, we found that of that $25 billion budget, 11.2 billion of that budget is best spent on non-structural risk reduction. And so that's important because when we see graphs like this in the plan, the kind of shaded area of the graph, that's risk being reduced by the structural projects. And then that hatched area at the top, that's risk being reduced by the non-structural component. So fully implementing this plan could reduce future damage by up to 70% under the lower scenario and 60% under the higher scenario as measured in EADP compared to a future without action. Risk reduction as measured in EASD shows similar effects, reducing coastwide risk by 78% under the lower scenario and 65% under the higher scenario. So fully implemented, the plan will reduce expected annual damage by $10.8 billion under the lower scenario and $14.6 billion under the higher scenario compared to a future without action. And Brian mentioned this point off the top, but the point I will leave you with is that this level of investment could mean that 50 years from now, under a lower scenario, Louisiana has less flood risk, could have less flood risk from hurricane and tropical storms than we do today. So I know that was a ton of information. That presentation was so much longer before Bryn made me cut half the slide. You can thank him for us potentially getting to lunch on that.
That was a great presentation. Thank you. It's amazing to see these Are there any comments or questions from the commission?
So you showed the moderate and the more severe scenarios. Can you speak to how they have changed over the iterations of the master plans? Like, is there a trend where the last severe scenario has become today's moderate scenario, for instance?
No, well, so that's not necessarily the trend. The lower scenario that we're looking at is a little bit higher than what was the low scenario in 2017. And the higher scenario is actually falls in between what was the medium and the high scenario. And so when I talk about there being a much better understanding, but still this range of possible outcomes, a lot of research and kind of summary reports, IPCC reports, suggest that the range of potential outcomes is narrowing. There still is, there are some caveats to that, but no, it doesn't necessarily trend the rates.
I've got a couple of questions. One is kind of more of a process one. But since we're here trying to figure out, among other things, really what the job of this commission will be going forward, we couldn't help but notice that this commission was not included in the acknowledgments of anybody who had anything to do with the framing of this. I was wondering why that is and why what we might do in the future. If this is going to truly be an advisory body.
Can I answer? So several of us are on the coastal advisory team, right, that also, that represents a couple of different layers that Stu talked about. I think even more are part of the regional work groups, and then there's a community engagement work group. So I think as though you don't see it necessarily directly from the commission, you do see aspects of that. I think you make up a good point. Karen, in her new role, represents us on the CPRA board, which is really, really important. And I think definitely worth a mention every time this group meets is that Karen is our voice on that monthly board meeting, and she's supposed to represent this group and their interests as well. So that's my take on it. But I'll let Stu or anybody else take that as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the answer. We've had a couple touch points with this group over the last 5 years, but you know, that role maybe perhaps through Karen could be better defined. And as Simone pointed out, quite a few folks here, or at least the groups they represent, have representatives on our existing advisory teams. there definitely is some coverage, but the kind of broader role of this group is a question that I believe is for Karen to help guide.
And just to follow up too, we work together very closely with Stu and his team and with CBRA to host the community conversations. You know about this. That was also an additional work on our part to bring the communities closer to this work before the plan reached even draft stage, to get input, to hear what questions they had. And so that was also our attempt to open this process up and to let folks know that there were people that they know that were working on this, and that we still wanted to bring it to them before it got finalized. I think, and now I don't want to speak for Stu, but I think we both learned a lot in that community conversation process. I can tell you that I learned things in my own community, but especially in Southwest Louisiana where I wasn't so familiar, and I think Stu and his team had a similar engagement experience.
My only point is that, and I think that's all terrific, and I think a lot of the community engagement is terrific, and in fact, it's more valuable than those things. But it does go back to, this is an advisory board. What are we advising about? Who are we advising? And it seemed to me it's a fairly fundamental, important thing going forward. So that's just, it just struck me that something this important and it merit the formal inclusion of this particular advisory, which there may be great reasons for that. But I just,
Well, I would say too, that if anyone listened to what I said at the beginning, if you actually listen to what I said,
well, nobody does
that over the last year and a half, we have been trying to figure out what is the role of this commission going to do. You had king billing roll off, you had an unprecedented hurricane season over the last several years, and so we really had hard conversations internally about what the role of this commission is going to be. Are we going to dissolve it? Is it still needed? And to answer your question, Mark, directly, is the timing of those conversations actually resulted in us reforming the committee under new membership now. Could it have been done earlier?
I don't offer that as a criticism.
Possibly.
Where we've been the last couple of years has been pretty rough sledding. But since we are talking about where we're going, it's just, enjoy the presentation. I think it was very informative. Enjoy the reading plan. But I do think that, on the question of, we need to, as a commission, come to a conclusion. We don't have to wrestle that to the ground today. That is, my observation from the process. I did have a couple of more specific questions, and one is in order to do all the great things we need principal resources. One is money, and the other is actually riverine resources. As you mentioned, sediment, fresh water, all these things. And I'm just wondering, as we look forward, do we have any real idea of what kind of riverine resources, whether this river, Pearl, Sabine, we're going to need, because we're seeing those rivers and those water resources being contended for elsewhere and by other constituencies. So, I realize we have a financing section that we look at, but I'm also wondering, are we planning for, ideas, that we should be thinking about, or how do we make sure that we know how much river we need and how we might go about better ensuring we have available when we need it?
And that's interesting. I guess we don't look at, we look at the utility or the uses of the river from Baton Rouge south, understanding the amount of sediment that's available, the amount of sediment potentially that will be available in the future. We don't actually consider what sort of maybe resources may be pulled further north. But we do have projections, again, not based on any sort of policy or use projections, but we do have projections of what future hydrographs will look like with climate change, understanding how, so we have a separate process for the Mississippi River that we do for all the local hydrographs, to understand what that Mississippi River hydrograph looks like, more highs, more lows, and to understand how that will impact the coast. So partially, yes, we incorporate that.
Can I jump into, I think at the end of the agenda, we'll talk about things that this group needs to work on. There was something that passed in WRDA 2022, Lower Mississippi River Study, right? That seems to hold some of the, so that's one of the things that I would love. I saw Neil here earlier, and I don't know if Chip could speak to it, but there's definitely some key pieces of legislation that recently just passed that we have to understand the implications of, and like, I think that is where that totally leads into, policy hits on these too.
It's one of the things I was saying, you know that the Mississippi River Commission Coalition is embarking on perhaps the most comprehensively study about this river, and it's going to include aspects of hydrology and habitat design. It seems like that would be an excellent thing for us to make sure that we're helping to inform and getting the most value out of it. Because one of my other question was, is looking at the maps of where land is going to be lost, it also means that we're going to be seeing changes in land use. And I'm guessing that we don't have an answer to this right now, but I think it's going to be important for us to learn really what is the availability of fresh water given the changes we're looking at. Not only the municipal supply, industrial supply, but agriculture. What we're watching is essentially not only a changing water level, but water chemistry is going to change with it, and that's going to define how some of these coastal communities are going to shape up. And because it's really struck me that, especially for the non-structural, we're relying on local communities to take the lead. We're going to watch, we're already seeing, with respect to insurability crisis and repeated storms, some communities are watching population decrease, they're watching insurability decrease, and they're watching land mass degrade and disappear, all of which will go to their ability to support themselves. I think that, especially when we're looking at, the financeability of this plan, in all aspects, that's going to have to be something we consider more. And then people like the insurance commissioner needs to hear from us, so their plans reflect sort of our plan. And my final question on that, in that vein, is very clearly, there's a lot of federal investment that is coming into this pipeline in the last 24 months. But it's also very clear that most of our elected officials do not support that. And that's fine if that's where we want to be. But if we're not, if we're committed to not receiving large doses of federal funding in the future, where is the state of Louisiana planning to find the resources to do some of this work? I think this is not just a political question, but I do think it's one that we have to say, well, if we don't want that resource, if we think that is a bad public policy, what good public policy are we going to put in place? I'm not familiar with any particular untapped financial resources within the state of Louisiana that we could replace, but just not the infrastructure. That's all.
Yeah, I just kind of want to circle back to the plan at hand, right? The 23 master plan. Having been myself part of the two previous plans, at least in the oversight capacity, what have you. There's only two regional workers in this plan, the coastal advisory team, a lot of people in this room. And Mark, I think you make a good point that this board, this committee should be absolutely involved, but not just collectively, individually, right? The way you represent your agency is by being involved in the regional work group, being involved in the coastal advisory team, that's the match. Basically, what I've observed in this plan is the amount of work that, Chip's team, Bryn, Stu, and I'm not going to name everybody because there's just way too many people, but the level of detail and the level of care that they put into this plan is just unbelievable, right? Every time they considered not just what they could do with new technology and new information, but what they should do, which goes towards making sure that what they used, they could deeply investigate if it was giving them the results that would be expected, not just by them, the modelers, but by the public. The public feedback, what that makes sense and doesn't make sense. It brings me to a very, very high level of confidence that they've done a fantastic job in choosing the right approach for us now. Of course, all of that new data that you're talking about will certainly be something that informs the 2029 plan. Which I'm assuming Sue's already started. But right, let's not let this group sit back and just say, okay, here's the plan. What do you think? It's a little late for that. Let's get in from the very beginning and be active involved in it and make this advisory commission bring those things to the table.
I'm in no position where I have the inclination to second guess the work that was done in this. I don't think that's it's a remarkable level plan. And as I say, I don't think I would suggest that we cut back on any other form of engagement. It's a more engagement process.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. I'll double down a little on what Wayne says. Obviously, most folks know I don't have a science background. I've heard this presentation quite a few times. And there are still times where it's almost overwhelming how much work has gone into this plan. And to go into these communities and to hear the people say the same thing, oh gosh, y'all been thinking about this, and it really made an impact. So definitely, Stu and the team have been just heads down working on this so hard. I do want to point out two features that I would love to talk about in the future, especially with this group. They updated the master plan viewer, which is an incredible resource. We used it so much in 2017. It is a very easy online user interface that you can look at it coast-wide. You can enter in an address. I used it just yesterday to look at some information. That was made available when this plan went online. Data will keep coming onto that. I told this story the other day too. My 12-year-old had a science fair project and we used the viewer. And so it's just an incredible resource. So I definitely, if we can send that out to make sure that the commissioners get that, it's really great. And it's online available now. There's some other ways that it could even be better. I think that's a really incredible tool. I think the nuisance flooding or the high tide flooding that Stu talked about is something that this group would absolutely love. It is overwhelming the amount of information they put in the plan, and this is just a golden nugget that came out of it. They went across different communities and they talked about, and Chet can appreciate this, how many times LA1 has water on it on a sunny day, right? And that's one of the cases that we made to get the elevated highway, right? But it speaks directly to that. So it goes beyond just charts and graphs, and it goes directly to what you see every day in the community, not just after storms. So I would love to see, the plan was just released, the viewer was just made available, and I think we could talk about this for a very long time, all of the great information and resources that's available there. So good job, Stu, and I hope that we can help you bring some of those other resources to life.
And I'd just like to say at this point that I'm very grateful to Governor Edwards appointed Simone as vice chair. I couldn't say that earlier.
Oh, thank you.
I've got a couple of brief comments. First, Stu, I don't want you and Brandon and all you folks to get too big a head because everybody's crashing on the back door. I mean, we certainly understand, having gone through this first one as part of the staff, and really having no clue what I was doing. It's an incredibly involved process, but I just want to say from a ability to get through the plan and digest what's in it, find information, this is the best y'all have done. I mean, this is just from a presentation perspective, from the public being able to leaf through this, or a legislator, or anybody being able to go through this plan and find the information they're looking for, this is the most digestible one from that perspective that I've seen. So congratulations on that. I have a little bit of question, and I think maybe this is a presentation for a later meeting, but I was interested in seeing that some of the, say, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans diversions are featured pretty prominently in here. And I was wondering if there's some thought given as to maybe time frame for when some more specifications to be given to those projects. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about those projects. I think that a lot of people who live in those areas, you know, whether it be parts of Livingston or Tangipahoa or whatever, never really thought of themselves as coastal residents, even on the west side of the river, but now they realize they are every time the flooding comes right up to their back door. And that habitat is degrading so rapidly, and it doesn't present itself in the same way as a marsh not being there on a year-to-year basis, but at the same time that protection is being lost and that wildlife fishery productivity is going down significantly. So I guess I would encourage the development of those projects as quickly as possible so that we don't see just precipitous degradation of that and get to a point where it's too late.
Yeah, noted for sure. And there are technical pieces that I'll be happy to talk to you more about offline. But one of the why they remain vague in the plan, one of the reasons is the upcoming core comprehensive study and trying to tie or create projects that tie the flood control benefits with the restoration benefits of those projects. And so there's going to be additional work on our end in terms of evaluating different locations, operation regime, sizing, but it's going to have to be hand in hand with the core, or supporting the core's effort as they get into that process.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Stuart, thank you for the presentation. I was really pleased to see under the programmatic projects the words oyster reef listed in there. And I went back into the booklet and I didn't see a whole lot about specific projects or any more. I'm just curious because our oyster reefs in Louisiana are demolished. So I'm just curious what those projects might look like. And secondly, what are they for? What are we trying to accomplish with projects through oyster restoration?
And so typically the programs that CPRA participates in, we're building oyster reefs, is to serve a function of creating sort of living shoreline that can help reduce the erosion on nearby shorelines. They have the added benefit of hopefully being a source population for oysters, or for oysters. They're not necessarily strictly to supplement the oyster production in the coast, but they do serve pieces of that role as well. And so that's one of those things that you know, when we're building those projects, it's typically a half mile or 2 miles, or sometimes we've built some fairly large ones that have been, I think, 10 plus miles. But in terms of evaluating those scale of projects, the tools we have, that's why we put them in that programmatic category. They are best suited for those sort of programs that we have access to, that we've used to build those projects in the past. Yeah, so there isn't a specific dot on the map that says this is an oyster reef. There actually is one out of Biloxi, but we don't identify for the most part specific oyster reefs unless it's part of a larger project.
So let me go a little more specific on my question. There's recent studies that are starting to come out about the carbon capture benefits of the oyster reefs. Something I encourage this body to learn more about as we move forward. But I guess specifically my question is, are we hoping to build and restore reefs in order to potentially mitigate losses to reefs that are out there now because of diversion or whatever else might affect them? Or are they strictly for structural benefit, shoreline protection, and will they be able to be harvested, those sorts of things. Maybe we don't have the answers to those, but I'd like to learn more about that.
We don't have all the answers. I think kind of separately from the way that we conceive of oyster reefs as a habitat restoration for kind of a broader coastal ecosystem, there are mitigation measures associated with the diversion that are specifically about restoring or building new reefs in areas that are suitable for oysters with the implementation of diversions. I don't have the specific numbers of, but anyone else has this? Girl?
You want me to answer? No, I'm just kidding. I think that's the point of carving some of these things out programmatically, is that we know that we want to make space for that, but we need more details, right? And it wasn't fair to exclude it because we didn't have the details. To Dwayne's point of already bringing it up, I think it just put extra emphasis, including upper river diversions to CMAQ, that when it slid into this programmatic category, that means we have work to do, and not in a bad way. I think that's a good thing that they set aside the kind of budget for it and the consideration for it, but I think in a way it acknowledges that we have a lot of work to do getting into the details of it. And honestly, David, I never thought about the other kind of side of oyster reefs, even how you presented it. I always just thought living shoreline, so that's interesting. And not, yeah, I think
That's
all right.
Yeah, great segue to our oysters. I love that. I'm an oyster biologist, for those of you who don't know. But my question is really not specific to oysters. And I think I'm going more now into kind of like what Mark did. I want to talk about some of the recommendations for the future and everything, because oysters is something we are dealing with at Louisiana Sea Grant right now. And I'm leading a very big project right now for what's called alternative oyster culture. Okay? But my comment isn't about AOC specific, but it's about what I'm seeing in AOC and what I'm seeing in the fisheries, or let's just say renewable natural resources in general. And that is, Stuart, you did a great job of explaining this, and it is one of the best presentations I've ever seen in the way of the booklet. But you know, we're looking at reducing uncertainty. And what I'm seeing in this fledgling alternative oyster culture, off-bottom cage culture, what I'm seeing in the natural renewable resources, whether it be oysters, shrimp, or anything else, is the uncertainty with capital investment, the uncertainty of what's going to be happening in the future. And what we're experiencing in the AOC group, as we bring people into this fledgling industry, is that insurance agents and agencies, the financial communities, really don't understand the fisheries. You have these financial institutions and insurance institutions that have specialists that deal with agriculture and navigation and shipping, but we have no one who really, in the second largest state in the United States in terms of contributing natural resources, we don't have anyone who is a specialist that, to my knowledge, in fisheries and the economics and the uncertainty that goes with that, and the ability to project what insurance costs are going to be, or how you can even go to a bank and ask for capital investment. And it's something that we're seeing quite dramatically now with this little AOC fledgling thing, just to try to find insurance for some of these people, or even getting a bond to be able to say, if I lose my crop, can I get something back? The insurance field and the financial field, it's amazing how we're finding very little knowledge in Louisiana and actually across the Gulf in terms of how do we, I guess the question is, how does we as a group make a recommendation that we find the resources or the ability to bring our financial institutions and our insurance institutions up to the point of understand how fisheries work, and if we're going to have discussions, Mark, with how we're going to use the river fisheries become central to that, and renewable natural resources in particular. And it comes right back to capital outlay and capital investment, and these fishermen have no clue what will be happening tomorrow, much less 5 years from now. And I'm just finding that we're hitting a stone wall with trying to find people who are interested in helping from the insurance and banking community to even discuss fisheries with people. And I know that's not necessarily part of what you're discussing now, Stuart, but I think in the future I would hope to see more of that aspect in the 2029 plan.
All right, I got a comment. I read Dr. Stewart about whenever they have a meeting in our area. But this is an example. The Creole Cameron watershed CPRA recently completed. It's on Highway 27 in Cameron Parish, which was a good thing. However, we run into a drought. The Army Corps engineers opened up the locks at Calcasieu, flooded the whole project with salt water. It's dead. So when we do projects like this, that is something that we've got to take into consideration, because the Corps, they're going to do it their own way. You got to have some kind of knowledge. Hey, they might do this in order to protect our investment. All right, one of the problems that we are facing from the Vermilion Bay to the Calcasieu locks is that the intercoastal waterway is silting up. The Army Corps engineers' answer for that is to raise the water level. When you raise the water level so that the boats can traverse the tubs, you put excess water in your fresh marshes, then they die. None of the high ground will drain because the water has no place to go. And they don't care. I have areas in front of where I live where I run cows. With the drought was the first time it dried out in 5 years. The reason why? Because the level of the intercoastal. If they would dredge it, drop it back down, the higher ground would drain. Drain the marshes, that chance for natural vegetation to come up, which would help in restoring some of the coastline, because you'll have your natural vegetation and your root structure to help hold the marsh in place. Because all the marsh around our area in Cameron Parish is an old Frenchman called floatons. It's floating turf. You hit a lot of areas that you have no bottom. You have some soil where your plants are growing. But whenever you increase your water level, the turf rises with it. Then you get a storm surge come in, it starts going up. And I talked to Brent, I said, no, just give them the idea. You ever thought about coming in with a joint venture with the Corps to help them dredge the intercoastal? Because if you do that, you can throw all your spoil on the south side, because there's been a lot of talk about putting a protection level in there. But, boom, gee whiz, killing two birds with one stone. You're going to pull the settlement out of the intercoastal, you won't be able to let it. It's going to slow your storm surge up. I'm sorry that Creole, Grand Smear, and Cameron won't be protected, but your Great Lake area up toward Lake Charles, Lacassine, and all that, they will be. You know, it's an idea I think it needs to be looked at. If you want to spend a couple $1 million on a project in a freshwater marsh, you damn sure don't want salt water coming in there. That's what creates all your open water marsh. And whenever you do that, you have a storm surge, you got a mess, because there's nothing to slow it up. That's my comment. CPRA has done a great job. Because some of these things, you know, you can't really help with it, and you don't really know that till after it happens. But I just want to throw that out.
Yeah. Sue, can you speak a little bit, or anyone else, about incorporating operations and things beyond our city?
Yeah, so drainage in the Chenier Bank is obviously the key to all of it. When we talk about these regional approaches, there's a write-up kind of on some of the key features to that operation. When we make assumptions about how those big controlling locks are simplified assumptions about when they're open and closed. But we do, it's not presented in this master plan, have plans for basically uncertainty tests. What if we change the operations or make them slightly less restrictive? How does that affect? And I think we'll see what is being presented there, which is that the system is highly dependent on those locks being consistently operated the way that they're permitted to be operated. And slight changes in that are going to raise water levels, could raise water levels and salinity simultaneously in some cases, which is going to be problematic for the system. But yeah, everything he's saying is correct.
Thank you again for your presentation. This is very interesting. I appreciate that. I think my comment is for the future. And one of the things that I keep thinking about as you go into the plan here, and at the end, you have, what you say, beyond the master plan. And you're thinking about the Louisiana watershed initiative, thinking about the climate action plan. And I keep thinking back, well, how can we really have a holistic view of our resiliency if we're not looking at floodplain management, and if we're not looking at climate action plans for many of our residents. And with that being said, the whole purpose of us being here is to consider the residents of Louisiana. And if they don't have a place to live, and if they don't have a way to fill the supply or create the supply, then what are we actually doing? And one of the things that I keep going back to is why that information is not included in the coastal master plan, or if there is a possibility of a creation of a larger statewide plan for floodplain management. We can't talk about coastal if we talk about multiple master events, if we're not talking about inside and outside the levee systems. And one thing that hasn't been brought up here is, again, urban space resiliency measures. And I haven't seen that in the coastal master plan for quite some time. And I know here you see you have $11 billion in non-structural risk reduction. But again, that's just talking about raised homes. That's not looking again at the multitude of opportunities that we could utilize. And I also want to, there was a couple of people who mentioned insurance here. We have to think about that and the ability for residents to stay here, to work, where we're talking about fisheries, we're talking about farming land, we're talking about oil and gas. I don't see any of that in here, and that's, to me, a grave concern. If we're not thinking about that, then what are we creating a post-war? And the prognosis, even at its best, is not good for any resident so far. And we have to be realistic about that ability if we're going to be able to create a space for residents to live. And if not, are we talking about mass climate migration? And if we are, how are we going to fund that as well? Or who's going to fund that? Or how are residents going to pay for that if they can't even pay for the ability to recover from Hurricane Ida or any hurricane for that? So I think it's just something for us to think about in the future. I work a lot in urban water management, and we're living in silos. And it's not working. We're wasting dollars, we're wasting space. We have too many government agencies here at the state level that are spending money in duplicative processes that are not looking at it holistically. And furthermore, we're not pushing that on parishes to think about, okay, here's the coastal master plan, here's the LWI programs, floodplain management. What are we doing on the policy side? That's my first comment. And my second comment, again, is about the water quality. My other commissioner mentioned that it is imperative. We do not have water to drink. We will not be here. Point blank. And the water quality in Louisiana is degrading rapidly. And we're not talking about that. Our aquifers are running out across the state. The quality of the Mississippi River, as you know, is at its lowest level this year. Many parishes drink Mississippi River water. We're not thinking about that either. So I think we just need to look at this at a more holistic level, and including different agencies in this conversation for this commission, and also including different plans to look at all of the parishes in a holistic state.
Thank you, Karen. I came here today and said I was going to be quiet. I'm going to try to be terse and on point. I agree with Dr. Davis' comments about Governor's Advisory Commission. Just the main things we're advising the governor. I will say I've raised this in other venues, but there used to be a navigation focus group, which was wonderful for the Mississippi River, because we were able to talk about projects' impact with navigators. That was, I'll say disbanded, there may be a better term, with really no notice. I looked at the advisory team and I see the bar pilots or associated branch pilots are listed. That's the only navigation group on the Mississippi River other than Canal Barge, which is a shallow draft interest, a big player, but their concerns are different. Big River Coalition files a lot of comments on projects. I'm glad that low water was mentioned. We have a habit of talking about high water. This last low water season really caused a lot of problems, and I think one of the things that became very clear to me, I'm sure there's an expert in the room that knows the Kasman-Johnson report, the full title, in a lot more detail than I do, but fresh water, drinking water in the lower river is a major concern. I will spit out a date of March 24th, 2012, where we had a river flow at Belle Chase of 776,000 cubic feet per second. By the time it got to Head of Passes, it was right at 200,000 cubic feet per second. We're losing a great deal of flow. These breaks and crevasses are what I would call straw. And the water's going to flow with the side with the most pressure. And several of those crevasses, salt water was coming into the river from wherever that, and all on the east side of the river. I continue to see projects, the beneficial use projects, as good, sound projects. They're still complicated. Even the best one has negative impacts to navigation that we work to mitigate. But I would again come back to say that we were a fan of the navigation focus groups. It's bigger than one person. It's bigger than Shondup. It's bigger than Big River. It's bigger than one power group. And as we are advising, I know those comments are filed and they're there and happy to talk about them, but the impact, economic impact of the river is more, we're concerned about more things than economics. Water management, sediment management are huge things. I made a presentation to the Mississippi River Commission and was asked afterwards, where did you get these numbers? We weren't really tracking those. And they came, of course, from the Corps of Engineers. Looking at maintaining drinking water for the city of New Orleans as we start to see what I would call collapse on the east side of the river is very important. And I think we should be looking at projects on that side of the river as well. Happy to be here. Glad we're in reform. I'll continue to come. Like to see more direct focus, and I won't speak for any other watershed. Mississippi River Ship Channel, that's how we do. Thank you.
Thank you. I think if we can, or Sue standing up here, think about the master plan, because I've heard a lot of good thoughts that are kind of going into our next agenda, or our later agenda items and issues we should take up. So any specific questions or about the master plan for Stu?
No, just a comment. Kudos to you and the team. Everybody was great. Speaking on behalf of PACE, they are very appreciative of every time you guys came to the parish, having many conversations, and their voices really help heard. There's definitely bigger picture stuff to work on, especially with floodplain management and watershed initiative, but a whole other topic. But anyway, thank you guys so much. They really appreciate it. So, and great job on the book. Awesome.
Any other questions? Been a great conversation. Thank you.
I want to make a closing comment if I could. Guys, I think that the most important word that we should pay attention to on this plan as it's presented today is draft. And so we could probably sit here all day and coulda, woulda, shoulda this thing to death, but this is a plan that is still in draft format. It is being presented to this commission in a draft format. There's going to be a series of public hearings that we're going to be doing across South Louisiana, and there will be another meeting of this group before this plan is approved by the CPRA group. So I think there's been a lot of great comments, productive participation, which is the word I like to use, things for us to consider. I think to your point, sir, I think that there are some things that we are doing right now in Calcasieu, when we reprogram the Calcasieu salinity control money, some things that we're working with Representative Oriak on surplus. I think to your point, Jessica, I agree with you in principle, but there is still a role under the law in which CPRA operates in. Statewide flood control, floodplain management, all of those things are done by DOTD. DOTD is operating on our board, but if you'd like to see aspects of this plan beefed up between draft and final, I would encourage you to put those on a record in a formal way. You've done so here today, but I think that there's going to be opportunities for us to maybe beef up aspects or talk about other complementary efforts that the state is undertaking, from floodplain management, from watershed initiative, from climate initiative task force. There is a section in the back on the climate initiative task force, but I'll end with where I started this morning. Is that now's the opportunity for you to take this information that you've heard today back to your interest groups, your stakeholder groups, and then put them on the record of things that you'd like to see changed, or things that you are happy with here. Because there have been, if you look back in 2012, 2017, there have been significant changes between draft and final. And so your concerns are not going to be falling on deaf ears at the CPRA level. So I just encourage you to continue that productive participation as well.
And if you have any questions as well, for example, CPRA sits on the Washington Council, right? And the interlocking with your CPRA, I think it's good for us to better understand that and taking the opportunity to listen and make suggestions. All right. So, shall we go on to formulating recommendations, Charles?
So I think that a lot of you guys have done a lot of this already. I think mostly just to kind of open this back up is that our intention is to kind of be an advisory commission and really make these formal statements that can help Chip and Brent and the governor kind of just appreciate kind of where this group's headed and where it's coming from. And so to that end, we don't want to ask you to make a recommendation based on this presentation you just heard over the last 30 minutes. And so the idea is just to kind of start that conversation to make sure that you're aware that we are intending to drive towards these recommendations in the future. And so I think we already heard a lot of good starts into that. And so I think for the next meeting, and so like in future meetings, we'll have a kind of a recommendation voting kind of section on the agendas where we kind of do formally adopt positions, whether they're endorsements or critiques or however they need to look. But in that being said, I do think that it's good to kind of, if anybody has another germ or seed of a recommendation or an issue that they kind of want to put on the table now, I think it is a good time to do that as we kind of work towards this April meeting that Chip was just kind of talking about.
I have 2 points. One, I think, has nothing to do with your work, but I think that it's vital for each of us individually here to always remember that this is not the Edwards administration plan. This is going to be a plan we live with. We have an election coming, and I think it's vitally important that each of us takes whatever opportunity we have to educate people who are seeking elected office, understand how this plan, what it does, what it doesn't do. And really, if you will, to depoliticize it to the extent we can. And it's been essential at every election that I've been involved with since the early 90s, to be honest, that it takes stakeholders to contextualize this for people who quite frankly have never had to think about it. So I would first of all urge that not only take advantage of the opportunity to comment, but also take advantage of the opportunity to educate. It's going to really matter. Second, I think Lori discussed that there's going to be a need, for example, to look at navigation policy. How we operate, various flood control projects, floodgates, things like this, and how we include folks like DOTD or don't. It's some that's going to turn on the legal architecture of achieving the purposes of this plan. I do think it will be important for the state, this body, to have at least a greater source of input on law and policy aspects. This is a wonderfully technical, informed document. But if we want to, for example, get higher levies in Metro New Orleans or, more games of the Gulf, we're going to have to take every opportunity to, I think, expansively read the authorizations that we have. It will take 15 to 20 years otherwise if you ever get.
To read the authorizations.
Right, I read it, and quite frankly, I don't think the secret, when we read the Lake Pontchartrain and vicinity levy authorization more expansively than does the Corps. That's not just academic stuff. It goes to whether or not you can begin, working with your federal partners to get the most out of the authority you have. Otherwise, you have to get it. And you have to go get it in the face of every other community in the United States that's trying to do it. I think the same thing holds true with how we manage navigation structures, how we manage all sorts of infrastructure, and how we coordinate across agency lines. So I do think the legal and policy dimensions here are vital to address more clearly. Just keep in mind, if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't have this. There would be no CPRA. That's exactly what was done. Following hurricanes and Katrina, that's exactly what was done when the state created this coastal program starting in 1989. So I just believe that the technical credibility of this report is a fundamental foundation. But I also believe that we need to be looking, I think this goes back to those comments. If we want to look at how you can use dredging policy and beneficial use of dredging material, that's governed by someone's interpretation of law. And you want to live with that, you change it or you change the law. I think those are things that we have to have a better handle on, because we're going to be bumping up against the constraints that law and policy and their interpretations. Because I said earlier, water and dollars are the most critical resources we're playing with, and I was wrong. Quite frankly, time is our most valuable. What we need to be trying to get the most out of every minute we have, and that requires, I think, if we want comprehensive water management, it's probably our job to help get it.
To drill down further more on what you're saying about law and policy and these funds and sources of material or that the natural resources of riverine areas. It's not just the Mississippi River or the Atchafalaya or the Calhoun Ship Channel. There are a number along our coast. And to drill down further, the Corps of Engineers needs to be a part of. That's the next issue that we need to get them in here, because I really think that we need to keep hitting them in the head with that hammer. They have silos of funding, and they can only do a new project, construction project, O&M, or ecosystem restoration. And most of the time, at least in coastal Louisiana, it makes sense to use $1 from every pot to do a single project that gives you all the benefits of all of those different pots of money. But they can't do that. It doesn't compute, they can't connect them, and it doesn't make any sense. And that's something that we've been working on for years. And I think now is as good a time as any for us to really push that, if you don't want it to be nationwide, it should be at least Louisiana-wide, because that's what's important for us. And we've proven as a state that we're doing the right thing, and they need to join in on that effort. I know they're doing great work at the Birchwood, and they're doing a lot of good work in the Mississippi River. But again, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to do an ecosystem restoration project with this material. Well, all the dredging that takes place in the entire Louisiana coast should be doing that. We do it as a port authority when we do our dredging, but they don't always do it. They say they do it when they put it in the coastal, but it's just going away. We're wasting that material. And that's a sin in the state of Louisiana to do that. I think that's something that would go a long way with the master plan and all the marsh creation that we have in it. If we can get the Corps to really play on the same level that we're trying to play on ourselves as a state.
And I would say to Mark, to your point about kind of the advisory aspect of this, the Corps used to meet quarterly with NGOs and lots of people. They stopped doing that a long time ago. They hardly ever bring us back in there. And I'm not just talking about NGOs, I mean anybody. And so I double down on the fact that we have to get the Corps in here to answer some questions that we have. CPRA does a good job of calling them to the table for CPRA, but they've cut stakeholders out in a large part of the process, and I think we have to call them out on that, and I think a way that we can do that starts here too. I also think, I wanted to ask you this, and Karen, years and years ago, you worked on the Mr. Go, like we had like a subcommittee, we had a diversion subcommittee, a funding subcommittee. It seems like one of the more natural places as we kind of grow and evolve as this updated commission would be a policy committee that could come back and make recommendations. A lot of times when we would pass resolutions and stuff, I remember you guys would think about like lawyer stuff doing it, right? I think one way that if we had a policy committee, we could vet some stuff off to the side, we could present it, and then we can have it better packaged up. But I totally agree about policy aspects, and I think that might be, and some of that's funding too, right? So there's lots of things that come under that, but that might be a natural way to have kind of a subgroup working.
I think a great example of maybe the place to start is, what the Corps will count in a kind match goes a long way to determining what we get done. And quite frankly, they're fairly conservative rules that in many ways are work against doing work that even they would like to do. And I agree, these are not necessarily Louisiana specific, but we have to start somewhere. But I'm just saying, I think it's really vital that we understand. First of all, so you don't start criticizing people for things that they cannot do. You cannot tell someone they're doing a bad job if you help they impact their job. So,
sure you do. It just won't be
I remember, this is a great discussion, and we have so many areas of focus that we could capitalize on, run with, and I remember some of the best meetings I ever attended of the commission. I remember one clearly was an entire day that was focused, because of critical need at that time, on insurance. We had an insurance commission, FEMA, the risk rating discussion, DOTD there. That was a whole huge day of that. And I think if we can narrow down as a group what some of the key focal topic areas could be, you could almost have, if we're doing quarterly meetings, we can pick and choose those key topics and almost have an annual agenda, barring any excitement or need to have, additional enrollment type presentations. I really feel like you can plot and plan this out in advance. And I don't disagree that the Corps needs to have its own day. There's so many things. Some are really old, over control, how are we doing, what's the management update? There are a million things we've been talking about for 20, 30 years, really. But certainly restoration being the third leg of the stool, how are you going to proceed with all these things that Trevor's talking about in terms of PU and regular operation. But I guess what I'm saying is if we can come to some kind of consensus on what the key areas are that we think 2023 is going to hold and be most important to tackle, that would be helpful. And I would also like to bring up something that we kind of haven't discussed, or nobody's kind of really pinned down, and that's fiscal futures. I mean, we talk a lot about federal investment. Everybody in this room knows that the state's current investment in the coastal annual plan is less than 1% of the whole investment this year being 1.3 billion. We've got to talk about the financing of this into the future as we hit the coastal fiscal cliff when the BP money runs out in 2032. We won't have any more money. We'll have a lot to talk about, but we won't have any money. And so, as Martin mentioned, this is the plan, this is the master plan, and this group is being convened at the end of an amazing 8-year run by Governor Edwards and into a new era that is presently unknown. And we've got to talk about financing and figure out how we're going to keep the train on the track. So those few items I wanted to mention.
Thank you, and I like those thematic meetings as well. I thought they were very helpful, so we'll do that. Earl? Oh, I'm sorry, Chris. I'm sorry, Earl.
No, I mean, no need to really yell. I mean, I think what Cynthia said is right on. And I'd like to add, I think there are several organizations, mine being one of them, and not that I'm responsible for this, but certainly having participated in it. And I think any of the other NGOs that are represented here, and of course the state, we're all trying to figure out how to tap into this type of money. So I think there's an enormous opportunity for us to sit down and figure out, present to this group what we've figured out so far in terms of how to get the agencies to best spend the money that came from those two large federal spending plans. And I don't think it was our congressional delegation not wanting the money, as was characterized earlier. It's trying to avoid the morass that we've gotten ourselves into, in which the laws were passed and handed out, large sums of money were presented to people with zero instruction on how to spend it, and with the agencies having really no idea or the staffing capacity to figure out how to get the money to the ground. And I certainly can understand from the point of a lawmaker wanting to avoid that circumstance in which you approve a bunch of money and nobody has any idea how to spend it. So I think if we can help as a group try to get our state to figure out how to spend the money, at least make recommendations to the federal agencies on how to get the money, I think that's an important role for this.
I'm just curious, does this commission do we have the ability to have subcommittees or whatever term you want to use?
Yes, we do.
Do we have them?
Well, we did have, it hasn't been active recently, but for example, the diversion subcommittee, Charles mentioned a few special topics that we've got together, so certainly we can form subcommittees. I remember diversions, we did a special attack on Mr. Go, and then funding.
And the only other thing I would add is we also have the ability to kind of bring in, federal agencies and other people who aren't on the commission, but to kind of be at the commission. This was one of our other powers that exist to this group. So we can, but I guess the last comment generally about it is, whatever subcommittee we create, we do it, it's still going to be a public meeting in a public body, and it's just a way to kind of focus in on something, or maybe pick a certain smaller subset of expertise that we have at this bigger table.
Well, I'd like to make a recommendation that as a group, we have to decide if we want subcommittees so that we can have work outside of this body to come back with ideas. And what subcommittees do you want? We don't want 1,000 of them, we don't want 100, but what are the main topics? And I think we should do that.
I think we should too. We just, as you said, we're following what our priorities are going to be. And I think it's a very important, again, as Charles mentioned, that's public as well, but I think it's very helpful for a subgroup to go off and flush out the
It's
issue.
really but we can come together as a group, but what do you accomplish in 2 hours?
Right, exactly. Okay. Steve?
I think that's exactly the right way to go, so I do want to say that. I also want to raise the uncomfortable question of resources and staffing, which, as far as I know, I'm looking at it. So as we build the set of tasks that we all want to take on, I think we have to grapple with what it takes to actually do these things well. And there's a lot of people who go around this table who come to these meetings for 2 hours, and that's all that we've done for 8 or 4 hours, right?
I think it's going to be key.
So that requires everybody at the table to look at each other and know whether or not they can step up and take some of these responsibilities as well.
Let's have a show of hands who's not busy.
I just want to be concrete about that on the front end, because we should bite off what we think we need to, but we don't do ourselves any favor by doing any of that for them.
Right, I agree, and that's, I think I'm asking every member of this commission to step up, especially in their areas of expertise, because I know staff at GOCA and staff at CPRA are already very strong, so I'm glad you brought that observation down, how important it is for us to support what we can do.
Yeah, I just want to make one also a comment. I do think that having a law policy supplement is going to be really important. I do want to push back on my fellow commissioner. I sit on 9 federal coalitions for IRA, IJA, 30x30, Justice 40, and there were tons of recommendations on how to spend that money, but our laws in Louisiana prevent us from spending it in the appropriate way, which is what I'm trying to say. In your earlier comment, when Chip said, well, this is what we do, and I think that needs to be expanded or redefined. We cannot, and we're going to run out of money. We have to have those hard conversations, and we also have to hold our elected officials accountable. We need this money if we're going to do any of the things that we're talking about, but it starts with a law and policy. There are tons of recommendations. I've said in hours and hours and hours of meetings with FEMA, with the White House, etc. They exist. We're not using them. And when I talk to DOTD, when I talk to DHH, when I talk to Human Resources, they tell me, I don't have those in my laws, I don't have to do them. And then the money is not spent. So we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, whatever we're talking about here, we can sit here and talk to each other for hours on end, but if there's no laws and policies that ensure that the state agencies are following federal recommendations, then we're wasting our time and our energy. And as Steve mentioned, our energy is very important.
Yeah, thank you. Is there a consolidated set of recommendations, or I know, but I would like to see that with the other commissioners as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think obviously law and policy is where this committee can bring a lot to the table because it's so diverse and things like that. So we're talking about the rivers, we're talking about the ports, but I think we can't lose sight of, and again, you can only do so much, and I'm about to fail on this particular committee, but the idea is that, so I'm just throw this out there because like I see it. Anyway, some of the things that like Earl said, for example, that, we can't forget in the end, our protection and restoration efforts have consequences. We want those consequences to be as good as they possibly can be. But in the end, if the oyster fishermen can't get insurance or a bond or anything like that, or some of the things that Ms. Jessica said with regards to, and I go straight back to flood insurance, right? If you can't afford to live here, where are we going with all of this if the people can't have the benefits from it? And yet I see to my left Stephanie, who's big time into bonds and financing and things like that. So I think it's exciting to see this group really putting these ideas that make a difference that to me need to go beyond, not just inform future master plans, which is important, but go beyond that, hit where the rubber meets the road for the people in Louisiana and how we're going to make sure that once this plan's implemented, those insurances, the ability to live where we need to live, and the financing that we can do to keep this ball rolling are all attacked somehow.
Yeah, sorry to hear your day.
Well, we'll get somebody in my chair, but
No, that's great, and I think it's that's a very important thing to have to.
Karen, do you have a list of what committees were once within the group? I mean, were there committees at one time?
There were, yeah.
Do we know what they were?
Well, if you just mentioned the diversion subcommittee, the MRGO subcommittee.
That's kind of very specific. I'm talking about something more like, say, a renewable natural resources committee.
No, I think
a policy,
right.
A law and policy committee.
Right. No, I think we can do that. We haven't had subcommittees before. We can do it again. Taylor, what we want to do.
Well, I'd like to put on the table renewable natural resources. I'd like to put on the table a law policy.
The CPRA board also has the power to do committees, and they've done it at times, and then they've been more or less active over time. And so right now, I think there are a few. There's the levy, the levy consortium, and the NFIP committee. So I think coming up with a list of things that used to be, I think it's more helpful for us to kind of figure out what we want to go there. So renewable natural resources on my list.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got things like all these oyster task force, shrimp task force, you name it. But it's kind of like, I don't want another committee assignment either. But at the same time, if we're going to function, we can't function in 2 hours of meeting four times a week. Not if we're going to really be able to advise people.
I want to get back to what we're referencing in terms of the master plan. It does go beyond, right? The commission started with helping the overall coastal program, which is national
Here, can I just add one thing too on that, on Dwayne's point in this idea of the overall coastal program, our office has seen over the past couple of years kind of an expansion of what that means to kind of support coastal restoration and protection through an expanded resilience effort that does try to open up lines of communication with Department of Insurance, Transportation, and other folks who aren't represented on either of those boards. So we could call that adaptive governance. It's an effort to kind of look at resilience more holistically. So I think that's kind of speaking to that. And so I think this commission does have the authority to also kind of go in directions that it sees as germane and relevant to the health of the coast. And the same with the kind of climate action plan, the way it's kind of a spin-off effort from kind of this central mission that we all kind of came to first, but it was clearly important to address alongside. So I think we have some latitude to find kind of that status and direction of the coastal program. The coastal program needs to do new things or those things, or so I think it's broad. It's all.
All right. Well, we are.
It's not for lunch, Karen. It's not lunch.
All right. Well, one more thing before we open it to public comments. As I mentioned, I'm very glad Simone is the vice chair. I always also like to point out that she is Louisianian of the year.
I definitely don't look like that now. Yeah. It's only $10. I'll be here after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Yeah.
People magazine.
Louisiana people. Okay, now it's public comment. Does anybody care to make a comment?
I have a comment.
Okay, please come on up and identify yourself and share your comment.
I'm Zach Lee, and I'm a stakeholder in that I'm investing in the oyster industry, especially the oyster industry that Dr. Malazzo was talking about. And I want to add my name to all the people who have commended the CPRA for the great work that they've done. But I also, in the spirit of public comment, criticism, critique rather than criticism, I'd like to chastise, if I may, you and CPRA for what I consider their lack of interest in the most amazing opportunity that we have in the coastal zone. And that is developing a very strong oyster industry. We have one of the biggest oyster industries in the United States today, but we could, with CPRA and your help, we could double or triple the size of that industry. And one of the things that I've advocated for years is that CPRA, as you, combine storm protection with oyster industry expansion. A good example of that are the terraces that are being built out in my marshes. A lot of times those are being built in areas where the marsh has basically been filled in by erosion. And so places like, for example, south of Island Road in Terrebonne Parish, there's a big bay there that is very shallow. And a lot of it is because of the erosion from the adjacent land. That land is being underutilized. We could be making millions of dollars off of that land. And one way to do it, again, is to provide terraces. And you may know terraces as the way we build roads in Louisiana. You know, we go along the marsh, we dig out a ditch, we pile all that dirt up. That makes a levee in the marsh. We would call that a terrace. And that ditch makes an ideal spot for raising oysters because it's deeper, but it also is protected basically from storms. Those terraces are speed bumps. And if we could build more of those, we would expand our storm protection. Plus, we would expand our wonderful, ecologically sound oyster industry. I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you. Any other public comments?
Good afternoon. Tyler Bosworth, Advocacy Director for the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. I wanted to thank the Commission for giving me an opportunity to touch on our upcoming State of the Coast Conference. State of the Coast is the largest statewide conference of its kind. The 7th Biennial State of the Coast Conference will be held from May 31st to June 2nd in New Orleans. Our conference theme, Together Again, reflects on our return to an in-person event, the importance of collaboration in addressing coastal challenges, and our vision for the coast. And I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight two important upcoming dates. January 17th is our proposal deadline for the conference, and January 31st is our end of early registration pricing. And with that, I hope to see you all in May.
What's the date for the pricing?
The early pricing is January 31st, and the commissioners should all have a little handout from CRCL up there.
Great.
Y'all have decided to extend that January 17th date a little bit, have you?
Not yet.
Can we pass a resolution?
We'll see what we can do.
Come on, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Any other public comments? All right, motion to adjourn. Very good.